What's up, guys? It's Q and A time. It is February 26th, 2018. Q and A topic this week was plateau busting, how to training, nutrition, or training fat loss, anything of that nature, how to get through plateaus, and questions related to that. It's kind of a tricky topic. I mean, some of the questions were directly related, others were kind of related, but I'm not going to be able to cover all of them, and there were some repeats, but I'll try to cover everything that hasn't been asked before. So don't feel bad if I didn't get yours. There's a lot of them. All right. And I have them on Instagram and Facebook, so let me pull up my first thread here. Okay. When hitting a plateau in which you can no longer add weight to the bar, but you feel recovered, how do you know whether you need to pull back on volume or increase volume in order to still progress? Okay, so that's a pretty good question, because you might hit strength plateaus when everything else is still clicking well. You know, your nervous system isn't necessarily burnt out. You don't need a deload. So what do you do from there? Well, we know a couple things. We know that progressive overload is one driver of hypertrophy, and we know that volume is another big driver of hypertrophy as well. So in this case, if possible, increasing volume would be a good option, just because, again, it's another driver of hypertrophy. You might not necessarily be able to increase weight, but if you can maintain your weights at least and increase volume, at least for a short time, you can keep pushing muscle growth in that way. Another way to do it would be rotate movements. If you don't want to push volume for whatever reason, maybe it's a time thing or whatever it might be, you can rotate movements as well. So reset on a new movement. You've been progressing on a flat bench press, move to an incline dumbbell press, reset your progression, go from there, not necessarily changing volume, but you're going to keep progressively overloading. So kind of two ways that you could do it. And there are other, subcategories there, I'm sure, depending on the situation, but those would be two main ways you could go about that. How can you work on increasing active range of motion, specifically for hamstrings? It certainly isn't a flexibility issue, but rather the exact opposite, a contractile issue. The active range of motion of my hamstrings is limited to slightly past 90 degrees of knee flexion. The hamstring feels fully contracted. I can assure you it isn't due to tissue amount limiting the range. I think this could potentially be holding back some growth. Is it an individualized anatomical problem? Are my attachments somehow too long or too short? It's probably anatomical to an extent. The way the hamstring attaches, the way the quad attaches. So it's an antagonistic system. So between the quad and the hamstring mainly, those are in the adductors and the adductors and the glutes and the hip to extent, all that are going to play into it. But the quad and the hamstring are the main two that are going to dictate one another's movements, if you will. So here's the thing with the flexibility as well. It might not be a flexibility issue of the hamstring. Let's say you bend over and touch your toes. You're flexible in that straight leg plane of motion, but maybe when you pull your hamstring or pull your heel up towards your butt, your quad is actually limiting range of motion. That could be possible, because again, when your hamstring's under flexion, when it's contracting, the limiting muscle in the stretch would be your quad, because it's pulling against your quad, or your knee, or at the knee somehow there's limited range of motion in the joint. So you could maybe look at flexibility in that way. I'm assuming that's probably not the issue, since you mentioned that it wasn't a flexibility thing. I'm assuming you probably have already kind of thought about that. But if not, That would be one way to look at it. Another way would be potentially doing some active stretching. So active stretching, look up, I'm trying to think of what the actual term for it is. I think it's P and F stretching, I think is what they call it. And excuse me because I don't remember exactly what that stands for. But P and F stretching, so basically the muscle that is being stretched is also being contracted. So it's supposed to help increase active range of motion and not just passive range of motion. Because again, the issue here is that, passive flexibility, you're okay, but active range of motion, you are limited, which isn't uncommon. Typically people have less active range of motion, especially if they have muscle tissue there, to any substantial degree more than the average person. So I would look into that. I would look into some active stretching and some stretches in that manner, PNF stretching. I've seen mixed reviews on it. I think there were actually some studies on PNF stretching, and they were kind of mixed. But just from observational evidence, I've seen it benefit people in a situation like this. So I would probably start there. Okay, so time under tension, is it a way to break through a plateau? So is it going to help with growth in that way? So time under tension, there's a lot of researchers that have talked about it. One that I can think of specifically is Brad Schoenfeld. I know he's talked about it. He's stated, unless his stance has changed, that really there's no good evidence to show that it is necessarily beneficial to do the super slow long reps. Rather, that time under tension throughout the entire workout is more indicative of progression. So let's say, let's give you an example. So for example, somebody that's doing sufficient volume in their workout, they're probably getting enough time under tension because they're doing enough sets. So time under tension would just be, all right, you did 12 reps and you did that for 20 sets or 15 or 25 or whatever. Your total time under tension, your time under tension during that set is 40 seconds times whatever amount of sets. There's, you have sufficient time under tension in the workout. Doing super duper slow reps with really light weight, not necessarily the same thing, and hasn't, to my knowledge, has not been shown to be extremely beneficial. Now, what I have noticed, and what a lot of other people notice too, is certain parts of the range of motion, especially the eccentric, it seems that if it might be beneficial to, in some cases, slow the eccentric down, and you can produce more muscle breakdown or tissue breakdown in that part of the range of motion. So, I do use tempo stuff sometimes. It just depends. It is also a good way to prevent injuries and stuff at times during certain movements. If you need to slow things down, you can still kind of replicate that the feel, just because the weight feels just as heavy because the tempo is slow. So it could be good in that regard. But to do a whole workout with super slow tempos is just not really going to be beneficial. Okay. Using exercise replacements and variations to prevent plateaus. And I really mentioned that one above, so refer to the first question. Rotating exercise or rotating movements to reset the strength progression, reset your progressive overload progression. So that would definitely be an option. Yes, I think that's what's being asked here. So we'll shift over. Kind of a broad one, but we'll cover this. So, biggest issues with females and muscle growth. So, like limiting factors. So, The first one's just hormonal environment. Genetics are different. Hormonal environment of a female is different than a male. Assuming we're talking about a natural lifter, not someone that's enhanced. Just right out of the gate, you're at a disadvantage in terms of muscle growth, just because again, your certain hormones, testosterone primarily, are just lower. It's I don't really ever see women over 100 total testosterone. Really, they're much lower than that typically. And if they get much higher, they're typically just women with PCOS, and which is also not necessarily good. Well, it isn't good, but yeah, hormones mainly. But that's obviously something that you can't really control unless the person's an enhanced lifter. Now, things that you can control that are kind of limiting to females. Sometimes it's just a body image issue. Sometimes they aren't willing to get slightly uncomfortable with body image to eat enough to be productive, and sometimes it's the opposite. They go through bad eating cycles. I won't say, I think in general females do go through more bad eating cycles than males as far as the disordered eating, binge eating, and things like that. Part of that's psychological, I think, but part of it is also that they're just more susceptible to it because maybe they put on fat easier genetically. So the biggest thing, and it's just like it's no different for males, is that you have to have productive growth phases. It has to be controlled. You have to have at least some sense of insulin sensitivity. So you're not putting on more fat than you're putting on muscle. That's the biggest thing. Gaining weight isn't necessarily the issue. It's that gaining muscle versus gaining fat takes a little more strategy. And I just don't think people are diligent enough with strategy. And that goes for guys too. It's just that guys get away with it a little bit more, I think, in general. Not all of them. I have plenty of male clients that don't get away with it at all. But what will, with the females too, if they have a bad experience there where they do put on too much fat versus muscle, then they're going to want to, of course they're going to want to lose that fat again right away. And that just kind of starts that cycle when their body's not really recovered. And we've probably all seen that happen. So that's mental and physical at the same time. And it's just, like I said, it's just more about having a proper growth phase set up. Next one. Long-term dieting phase. So clients in long-term dieting phase is not losing weight or dropping fat after several calorie drops and cardio increases. Do you have them raise calories for a short period of time and then try to go back in a caloric deficit, or are there any other tips and tricks to get the last bit of stubborn fat off? Okay, so context, like a question like this, context is really everything. If it's deep in prep and you're in a time frame, sometimes you're going to have metabolic adaptations. Things are going to downregulate. You're going to push into territory that is probably going to cause adaptions. Hormones will go down, metabolism slows, all that stuff's going to happen, but that's normal and temporary if you have a proper exit plan. Now, if the time frame is longer, then you might have a little more leeway to do things like a metabolic reset where you're bringing calories at least up to maintenance or just above maintenance for a few days. Normally a few days is going to be good. We know that most of the hormonal adaptions and the metabolic advantages don't really happen that quickly. It's not like, the one refeed meal, that's not going to do it in this case. When someone's really downregulated, the one day probably won't do it. 2 days might, 3 days. So seems to be in that 2 to 3 day mark at least where the good things are starting to happen. And there's, and there'll be signs of metabolic upregulation. Weight might even go down, as the metabolism goes up. And, oh, excuse me. Weight might go down. Weight might at least stay the same while eating more, which is also a good sign. Hunger goes up, all those things. So, but body temperature might go up. But yeah, it's a couple days, 2 to 3 days at least, if you're going to do that kind of thing. And you can think too that with that, you're creating that caloric bump through both cardio and through caloric increase. So let's say if you want to bring calories up to 500 calories for a few days to see if you can reset, remember that you can do 250 from your diet and 250 from cardio. And it's probably good to do both because the adaptions from both can be slightly different. So something to think about. And you can do longer phases too. I mean, depending on the time frame, sometimes I'll do a week with people. If they check in, I'm having check in another week, then we'll do a whole week and see. And that's nice because you just don't have that, you don't have that rush in there. It's not really a time crunch, and you can really get metabolic rate back up and try to reverse some of those adaptions. Other tips and tricks, that's really the main thing, is just keeping the time frame in mind. Don't go too big with it. It's not necessary. For most people, it's probably not necessary to do some massive overfeeding because you can still, you're still going to be able to put on body fat in a few days span, so you don't need to go 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 calories over maintenance. If you're eating, 2,000 calories, then 2,500, you know what I mean? It's like, it's not a lot of extra food, and you might even be hungry as your hunger kicks back up. So keep that in mind. Okay. Another good one here. How often do you find self-perceived plateaus to stem from clients' lack of self-confidence rather than actual physiological adaptations? This is a good one because I see this a lot. I don't know that I see it as much in experienced lifters, though it can certainly happen. But sometimes, I see it a lot in novice lifters or just anyone that hasn't really done well on the side of progressive overload or doesn't necessarily understand that concept. Just getting that weight on your back. I get that question sometimes. Coach, my rep scheme is 8. I'm supposed to do 8 reps on the set. I'm doing it well. I don't think I can go up in weight. Well, how do you know? Have you tried? Type of thing. You have to, sometimes the best way to increase weight in that kind of situation is just put the weight on the bar and try the weight and think that you can do it. Be confident that you can do it. Worst case scenario is you do 6 or 7 reps instead of 8, then guess what? You have a benchmark to hit that 8th rep the next week, and there's progression. And then, do 8 reps on that weight for a week or two, reset to a new weight, higher weight, and keep going up. It's just that sometimes people just never put that weight on the bar because they think something is going to tell them, oh yeah, you're ready for progression, when it doesn't really work that way. The previous weight might not ever feel easy. It might still feel difficult. So you think that you can't go up, when in reality, the way to go up would be to try the weight. So yeah, definitely stems from a lack of self-confidence, I would say, in a lot of cases. Like I said, especially with novice lifters or people that just don't have a very good grasp of that progressive overload and how beneficial it is. So yeah, I would say for most people, don't be afraid to try weights. Obviously don't be reckless and don't be a moron about it. You don't need to get hurt, but at the same time, you're going to have to try it, even if that means you lose a rep or two and you have to build back up. So a good example of this is I train with clients sometimes. They'll come in, they'll come into the gym or whatever. They travel in to see me and we'll train, and they're doing, I've had some pretty extreme ones too, where somebody's like somebody comes in and I have a gal come in, she's squatting 135 for, I don't know, 6 reps. And we start working up on squats, and I watch her 135, and her, it's supposed to be an RPE of 9 maybe. And I'm thinking, man, that's really easy. So maybe their perception of RPE is a lot different than mine. And I'm like, well, you can definitely go up. Well, I've never gone up before, So then they leave doing 185 for 6, and they're still not at failure. You know what I mean? So I see examples like that all the time. And then from there on out, their confidence is up, and boom, they start progressing. I have had that happen so many times, and with clients that they just hit PRs. They're getting all of those newbie type strength gains, even though they might have been training for a couple years. They just never push themselves enough to get those initial strength gains. But now they understand the concept. So yeah, good question. All right, I'll get one more, since there's another one on here about refeeds, extended refeeds, which I really already answered that question, so I'll skip that one. And this next one is, how strong is the correlation between gaining muscle strength and gaining muscle and gaining strength? Over the years, I feel I've put on a decent amount of size compared to the amount of strength attained. Well, I mean, we know that strength gain isn't going to be unlimited forever, probably. You're going to have to accept that it's going to slow down, and you're going to have to scratch and claw for strength gains to a point, once you get to a certain point. But we also know, like I said earlier, that volume is a big driver of hypertrophy too. So you have that kind of adjustment. Intensity comes into play. Quality of reps come into play. I know that for myself, there was a phase where I didn't really hit a lot of PRs, I would say, but the quality of my reps got better. I really focused on that, and the quality got better. And now now it's to a point where I can really activate whether I'm moving the weight explosively or whether I'm moving it slowly. Like I have good activation and connection with the muscle regardless. But quality of rep, volume, those things can all be adjusted. And strength plateaus too. Like I said, there are other ways to look at that progressive overload, resetting the movements and progressing again on different set of movements. That's always good. That doesn't necessarily mean that you ended bench press at 315 2 months ago, and then you did dumbbell presses for 2 months. So now you're going to go back to bench press. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll be right at 315 again. But let's say you start at 295 or 300, you might end at 320, okay, on this next cycle. And that's progression. I mean, this might seem small, but again, it is progression. You're adding reps, you're adding sets, and that's kind of how it goes to an extent over time. It's not going to be anything extremely groundbreaking for most people. So on that note, let's see. There's one more I'll cover real quick. It's kind of a broad question. So what is an acceptable amount of progress for and intermediated? I'm assuming just talking about intermediate lifter. How would you determine if you are stalled? So, I mean, it seems kind of self-explanatory. If you're stalled, you're not making progression in strength. You're not making progression in the mirror. You're not making progression on the scale. You're not making progression anywhere. I do think it is important to look at it from all angles and see, are you making progression in any of those categories or other categories before you determine whether you're completely stalled in progress or not. But yeah, I mean, that's just it. And a question that I get is, well, how long do I wait before I change things? That's hard to answer because it's a really contextual thing. But there's no reason to be stalled for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. It's just not really necessary. make changes. Make changes, get on with it, and keep progressing. And acceptable amount of progress, that's totally person dependent. I mean, everyone's capacity for progress is going to be different, how much people can make progress and how quickly. And I don't think that there's any way that we can say, oh, this person has the capability to make X amount of progress. If they're not making X amount of progress, then we need to change something. We just don't know those things. We don't know. Who's to say that doing something else might not elicit more results, but we don't know. So if you're making progress, progress is progress. Unless it's like brutally slow to the point where you can't see it. So I hope that was helpful, guys. It's about 25 minutes, so I'll go ahead and cut it here, and I will talk to you guys next week.